So now that you've successfully installed both MySQL Server and MySQL Workbench, we're ready to start working with databases and using the SQL language. Now, before we get into that, and we're going to create what is a schema, a database, and then also some data tables, which is the data sets that we're going to provide to you, I'm just going to first discuss these data sets. So we have two CSV files that we'll be working with during the seminar. The first is a summary stats data set of the Premier League for the most recent season, so the 21-22 season, and it has all the player stats per player during the course of the season. So how many goals did they score during the season, how many penalties, how many tackles, passes, all the different stats that Scout collect. We then also have an event data set for the Arsenal versus Tottenham game that took place on the 1st of October. Arsenal won this game 3-1. And this is, if you're familiar with event data, you'll know that this is every single action that took place on the ball in the game, and we have between 2,000 and 3,000 rows. So this is a more complicated data set. It's not aggregated, and this is what we're going to be working with in the second half of the seminar. So to get started, I'm going to demonstrate how to import the summary stats data set, as it's a bit simpler. So I'm going to open my SQL Workbench again. I'm going to click on the local instance, and here's some code that I've prepared. So what we're going to first do is create a schema or a database. So there's some little icons here, and the one we want to click on is this database symbol that has a little plus sign, create a new schema. So this is the overall database. This is where we're going to store all our data tables, and then from that we can start using this editor that we have in front of us to start working with the data using the SQL language. So let's give our database a name. I'm going to call it Scout because Scout have kindly provided this data that we're going to work with today. And I'm going to leave the character set and collation as the default. I'm then going to go to the apply button here. And the MySQL Workbench editor is actually proposing how we could do that with code. Now, I'm demonstrating that you can use both the graphical user interface and you could also write some code. And I'll actually demonstrate this at the end of this video. But for now, I'm going to click apply. And we can see that it's been done in the graphical interface. It said that the SQL command was executed successfully. So we're going to close this. And then I'm going to go to schemas here. And we can see that a Scout schema has been created. But this is currently empty, so we need to start importing the data that we are providing as what we call as tables. So to do this, I'm going to go to tables, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to the table data import wizard. It's then going to ask for the file path of the file. So I'm going to go to, for me, it's on my desktop, the data folder, and then I'm going to click this file, so the summary stats data set for the Premier League. So I've selected the file. I'm then going to go to next. And it's asking me if I want to create a new table, which I do. I don't want to use an existing table. And it's asking me what I want to call the table. So I'm just going to use the default name of the CSV file, which it's proposing. And there's a section here to say if we want to drop the table if it already exists. So if it already exists in our schema or database and we want to replace it, we would click this drop table and it will replace the existing table with the new table that we are going to create. But for now, because we don't have any tables in our schema, I'm going to just skip that. I'm going to go to next. And it's now going to ask me about all the columns in our data set and what field type that they are. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but it's going to ask us if it's an integer or text or a date time. We're just going to leave these as the defaults, which I believe are all integer. And we could actually change this later in the code. So no decisions that you take now, they can all be changed later on. So we're going to just leave these as they are. I'm going to go to next, and then it's going to say, right, ready to import. So we're going to click next, and we're going to just let that data import. And it's only going to take a few seconds. This is a pretty simple data set. Obviously, if you're working with event data that's got maybe 2,000 to 3,000 rows, it's going to take longer. If you're working with tracking data and you're using the raw form data, that's going to have a couple of million rows, so it's going to take a bit longer. We're going to click next. and we can see that it's successfully imported. There are 796 rows, which is the number of players that played in the Premier League last season. So I'm going to click Finish. I'm just going to close this from the previous step. And we can see the table hasn't appeared. So what we need to do is we need to click this refresh button here, which is something that you will find yourself doing often in MySQL. Things don't always refresh automatically. And we can now see our table is in the schema. So we are now able to work with it and use code to interact with this data set. So I'm going to just run this line of code that I've prepared earlier. Don't worry, I'm going to explain during the seminar what this means, but all you need to know is that what I've written here will display the data set if I run it. So to run it, I'm just going to click this little lightning bolt here. And we can now see that our data set has appeared. So it's successfully imported, and we can see that we can now use the language of SQL to interact with it. To just go back and finish off, we discussed how when we created this Y-Scout schema, we could also do it with the code. So I'm going to demonstrate this. I'm first going to drop the schema. So dropping a schema is deleting the schema, but drop is the language of SQL. So that's a term that you'll become familiar with. So I'm going to drop this schema. It's going to ask me if I'm sure, and I am. So I'm going to go, yep, drop now. And we can now see that schema is no longer there. If I was to run this command before to show the table of data, it will actually show that it's not able to do it because it no longer exists. So that's worked. And to just demonstrate how we can create a schema with code, you don't need to do this. You can use the graphical interface, but just to show that this works, I'm going to select the create schema and run that. I'm then going to refresh here. As I mentioned, this is something that you have to do, and we can now see it's been successfully created. And actually, to show how you can drop a schema with code as well, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to select this drop schema command that I'd already written, run it with lightning bolt, and we can now see that that's vanished. So that's how you create a schema. That's how you import data that we are providing as a table. And then we've just quickly shown you the most basic SQL command to display the data set. And yeah, in the seminar that will be taking place, we're going to go into more about how to use SQL and how to interact with that data.